The oil drum was an old 55-gallon container that had once held industrial degreaser behind the county maintenance shed. Now, it sat in the tall, graying weeds of the backyard, its rim rusted into a jagged, orange-brown collar. Evelyn stood over it, her fingers blackened slightly at the tips from the charcoal dust. She didn't use lighter fluid. She used kerosene from a blue plastic jerry can, pouring it in a thin, amber stream over the stack of envelopes. The letters had arrived in batches of 3 or 4 every Tuesday, postmarked from a federal correctional institution in eastern Texas. The paper was cheap, thin, and lined with blue ink that bled whenever the humidity in the mailbox got too high. Julian watched his mother from the back porch, his hand resting on the cold iron of the railing. The air smelled of wet soil, rotting oak leaves, and the sharp, chemical bite of the fuel. When Evelyn struck the long wooden match against the side of the drum, there was no dramatic explosion, just a soft, heavy gasp of air as the orange flame took hold. The blue-lined paper curled back like dry skin, the handwriting, hasty, desperate, slanted to the left, bubbling into black carbon before it vanished entirely into the smoke. Julian was 24 then, his knuckles scarred from working the sheet metal brakes at the local shop, his eyes carrying the same heavy, flat gaze as his mother's. He remembered when Chris first arrived in their lives. It was right after the divorce from Julian's biological father. A man who had spent 25 years quietly dismantling Evelyn's self-worth with soft-spoken cruelties and calculated financial neglect. When that marriage finally cracked, Evelyn had taken a job as a corrections officer at the county jail. It was a brutal place of green fluorescent lighting, concrete corridors that smelled of floor wax and old sweat, and the constant, rhythmic clanging of heavy iron doors. That was where she met Christian Vance. Chris was 45, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of dry pine with a dull knife. He was in on a third offense DUI, waiting out his weekends in the low-security tank. To Evelyn, who was drowning in the quiet aftermath of a ruined life, Chris represented something simple, someone she could manage, someone whose flaws were catalogued on a stay-tissued sheet of paper rather than hidden behind a respectable suit. Julian, his younger brother Garrick, and their older sister Clara had all moved back into the drafty, white-painted rental house on Elm Street to help their mother with the rent. When Evelyn brought Chris home after his final weekend stretch, the siblings maintained a guarded silence. Julian bonded with the man over late-night sessions of low-rent video games in the basement, the blue light of the television washing over Chris's weathered forehead while he drank cheap seltzers and talked about getting his life back on track. For a year, the house felt stable, if somewhat fragile, like glass that had been cooled too quickly. Then came the autumn of 2017. Chris was supposed to attend a routine probationary check-in at the municipal courthouse 3 miles away. He had borrowed Evelyn's faded blue sedan, promising to be back by noon to help Garrick clear the gutters before the rain started. Noon came and went. By 4 in the afternoon, the sedan remained absent, and the phone in the kitchen remained silent. It wasn't until 9 that evening that the landline rang. The voice on the other end didn't sound like Chris. It was thin, reedy, and accompanied by the hollow, metallic echo of a federal holding facility. He wasn't in the county jail. He was in Fort Worth, Texas. The story came out in jagged, frantic pieces over the next 3 days. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had been running a multi-jurisdictional wiretap on a narcotics and firearms distribution ring run by Chris's cousins in the Texas Panhandle. Months earlier, during a trip Chris had taken to visit his ailing mother, he had been photographed sitting in the passenger seat of a rusted Ford F-150, while a transfer of brown tape-wrapped packages took place in the gravel lot of an abandoned truck stop. The federal agents had waited, letting the net widen, before they stepped out of the shadows of the courthouse pillars in broad daylight and took him into custody. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table for 48 hours, her hands clasped around a mug of black coffee that had gone cold hours before. The phone calls from Texas were expensive, the automated operator's voice cutting in every 5 minutes to remind them of the cost. Chris was terrified. He was a small-time drunk, not a cartel soldier, and the prospect of 15 years in a federal penitentiary had broken him within 3 hours of his interrogation. He had agreed to testify against his own blood, his uncles, his cousins, the men he had grown up with in the dry brush of Texas. In exchange, the federal prosecutors agreed to a reduced sentence and allowed him to remain free on a strict personal recognizance bond until the trial date was set. When Chris returned to the house on Elm Street, he was a different man. The easygoing, quiet demeanor had evaporated, replaced by a twitching, gray-faced paranoia. He went back to his job as the manager of the local Dairy Queen, a franchise owned by an old high school acquaintance of his, but his mind was elsewhere. The drinking, which had once been confined to weekend beers, became a relentless daily necessity. Every afternoon, the yellow recycling bin on the side of the house filled with the heavy clatter of aluminum cans. He was consuming 12 to 15 beers a day, his skin turning a dull, yellowish gray under the neon lights of the soft-serve machines. He became a mean drunk, the kind of man who didn't shout but used a low, gravelly hiss to deliver insults that felt like rusty nails scraped across paint. He would sit in the living room, his boots still coated in the sticky syrup of the restaurant floor, and tell Evelyn she was lucky to have him, that no one else would look at a 50-year-old guard with 3 grown kids and a mortgage she couldn't afford on her own. He would glare at Julian and Garrick, his eyes bloodshot and watery, muttering about how they were parasites living under his roof, even though the lease was solely in Evelyn's name and the siblings paid more than 2/3 of the utilities. For 2 years, Evelyn bore the weight of it. She told her children that it was the stress of the upcoming federal trial, that the government was pulling his strings, and that once the testimony was over and the sentence was served, he would return to the man he used to be. She was a woman who had spent her entire life trying to salvage broken things, and she was not ready to admit that she had brought another wolf into her home. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday night in late October. The wind was coming off the river, carrying the smell of dead carp and wet coal. Chris came through the back door at 2 in the morning, his uniform shirt unbuttoned to the navel, smelling of stale lager and something else, a heavy, cheap floral perfume that didn't belong to Evelyn. He stumbled against the kitchen table, knocking a ceramic salt shaker to the floor where it shattered on the linoleum. Evelyn was sitting in the dark of the living room. She didn't turn on the lamp. She simply stood up, her uniform trousers still neat from her shift, and stood in the doorway. "Are you drunk, Christian?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of the anger he usually used to spark a fight. Chris sneered, leaning his weight against the refrigerator. "What if I am? What are you going to do, lock me in a cell? You're nothing but a turnkey, Evelyn. You don't run this house." Evelyn didn't raise her voice. She walked past him, opened the back door, and pointed out into the dark, cold rain. "Out," she said. He laughed, a dry, rattling sound, but when she didn't move, when her eyes remained as cold and steady as they were when she faced down inmates in the maximum security wing, the bravado left him. He grabbed his denim jacket from the chair and shuffled out into the gravel driveway, muttering threats about what would happen when he came back. The next morning, the house was silent. Evelyn woke Julian, Garrick, and Clara at dawn. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. "Get his things," she said. "Put them in the alley." They worked quickly, almost silently. Julian and Garrick carried the heavy cardboard boxes of his winter clothes, his grease-stained work boots, and his plastic tubs of fishing tackle down the back steps and piled them in the muddy lane behind the garage. Clara collected his loose papers, his shaving kit, and his spare boots. They were halfway through the task when there was a sharp, erratic knocking at the front door. Julian opened it. Standing on the porch was Elizabeth Betty Thorne. She was 25, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing her blue Dairy Queen visor and a stained apron. She had gone to high school with Julian, a grade behind him, and had worked under Chris at the restaurant for the last 18 months. She was shaking, her fingers twisting the hem of her apron. "Is your mom here?" Betty asked, her voice barely louder than the wind in the maples. Evelyn came to the door, her hand resting on Julian's shoulder. "Come in, Elizabeth," she said. They sat at the kitchen table, the shattered pieces of the salt shaker still swept into a neat pile in the corner. Betty didn't want water or coffee. She kept looking out the window, as if she expected Chris's silver Buick to pull into the drive at any second. "I can't keep it anymore, Mrs. Vance. I mean, Evelyn," Betty whispered. Her knuckles were white. "He told me he'd fire me if I ever came here. He said he'd make sure I never got another job in this county. But I can't look at you in the grocery store anymore and not say anything." Evelyn sat perfectly still. "Go on," she said. "It's Darla," Betty said, the name coming out like a mouthful of dry sand. Darla Gentry. She was 40, a regular at the drive-thru, a woman who lived in a rented trailer 3 miles past the county line. Chris has been bringing her into the store after hours, on the prep tables, in the back office. "I came in early last month to prep the soft-serve mix, and they were in the dry storage room. He told me if I breathed a word, he'd write me up for theft and call the police." Evelyn didn't flinch. Her face remained a mask of gray stone. "Is that all?" Betty swallowed, her throat clicking. "No, Darla's pregnant. She's 3 months along. Chris told her he's going to leave you, that he's happy because you wouldn't give him a kid." He's been taking money out of the safe to pay for her prenatal vitamins. When Betty left, the silence in the kitchen was heavier than it had been during the federal raid. Julian looked at his mother, waiting for the tears, waiting for the collapse. But Evelyn merely stood up, walked to the landline, and dialed Chris's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep and hangover. Julian stood close enough to hear the tinny sound of Chris's voice through the receiver. Evelyn didn't give him room to lie. She laid out the details, the prep tables, the dry storage, the safe, Darla. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Chris spoke, the whining, apologetic tone was gone. It was replaced by a cold, spiteful arrogance. "So what?" Chris spat. "Yeah, she's pregnant, and she's giving me a son, something your dried-up body couldn't do. I don't need you, Evelyn. I don't need your kids, and I don't need this house." "I've put your things in the alley," Evelyn said. "The officer will be there when you collect them. Do not come to my door." She hung up the receiver with a slow, deliberate click. For the next 3 days, Evelyn went to work, came home, cooked dinner, and slept. She wanted to wash her hands of him, to let the federal court in Texas take him and grind him into dust. But Julian, Garrick, and Clara were young, and their blood was hot. They had watched this man humiliate their mother for 3 years, watched him drink her salary, watched him turn their home into a place of quiet terror. They were not satisfied with a clean break. On Friday night, while Evelyn was working the night shift at the jail, the 3 siblings sat around the kitchen table. "We start with the job," Garrick said, his voice low. The Dairy Queen franchise wasn't owned by a corporate monolith. It was owned by Arthur Pendleton, a man who had lived in the county for 60 years and went to the same Methodist church as Evelyn's sister. Julian called him on Saturday morning. He didn't use hyperbole or anger. He spoke with the same clinical precision his mother used when writing incident reports. He told Arthur about the after-hours visits, the dry storage room, the health code violations, and the money missing from the safe. Arthur Pendleton was a man who valued his reputation above his profit margins. By Monday afternoon, Chris was called into the regional office. He was terminated immediately, his keys confiscated, and a formal trespass warning was issued for every Dairy Queen franchise in 3 counties. 2 weeks later, Betty Thorne was promoted to store manager. Her salary increased by $4 an hour. She ran the store with a quiet, fierce discipline that left no room for the grease and laziness of the previous administration. Without a job or a home, Chris moved in with Darla in a gray, single-wide trailer in a small coal town an hour's drive north. Within 3 weeks, Julian's contacts in the neighboring county confirmed that Chris had found work at another fast food franchise. Another Dairy Queen, this one owned by a different group. Julian called that owner too. He didn't make threats. He simply sent a certified letter containing the police reports from Chris's prior DUIs, a copy of the termination letter from Arthur Pendleton's franchise, and a brief, polite note suggesting that the new management check their dry storage inventory daily. It took 6 weeks of quiet pressure, but eventually the regional manager decided that Christian Vance was too much of a liability. He was let go on a cold Tuesday in December. Then came the stalking. Chris had no job, no money, and his federal trial was still months away. He began to appear in their neighborhood. Julian would look out his bedroom window at midnight and see a silver Buick LeSabre idling under the dead branches of the willow tree at the corner. Sometimes the car would sit there for 2 hours, the exhaust rising in pale, white plumes against the black sky. Chris was driving without a license. His privileges had been permanently revoked after his 3rd DUI, a fact he had hidden by having Evelyn drive him to work or walking the 4 blocks to his shift. But now, in the grip of his ruin, he was behind the wheel of Darla's car, circling their home like a starved dog outside a smokehouse. Julian didn't call the police the first time he saw the car. He waited. He noted the times, always between 10 and midnight, always on nights when Evelyn was on the late shift. On a Thursday, Julian walked down to the county sheriff's substation. He spoke to Deputy Miller, a man who had worked with Evelyn for 10 years. "Chris Vance is circling the house," Julian said, placing a small slip of paper on the wooden counter. "Here are the license plate numbers. It's a silver Buick registered to Darla Gentry. He doesn't have a license, and he's usually got a half-empty case of Milwaukee's Best in the Footwell." Miller looked at the paper, then up at Julian. He nodded once, a slow, heavy movement of his chin. "I'll tell the night shift to keep an eye on Elm Street," he said. 3 nights later, the blue and red lights flashed against the white siding of the neighbor's house. Julian stood by the living room window, watching through the slats of the blinds. The silver Buick had been pulled over near the intersection. 2 deputies stood by the driver's side door. Chris was pulled from the vehicle, his legs buckling as his boots hit the asphalt. He failed the breathalyzer on the spot, his blood alcohol level nearly 3 times the legal limit. Because he was already on probation for his prior offenses and awaiting federal trial, the judge didn't offer bail. Chris was sent straight to the county jail, the very facility where Evelyn worked. By law, she was reassigned to the administrative wing to avoid any conflict of interest, but the inmates in the general population knew who Chris was. They knew he was a snitch who had turned on his own family in Texas, and they knew he had treated one of their favorite guards like dirt. Chris spent his 3 weeks in the county jail in administrative segregation, staring at the gray concrete walls of a 6x9 cell, listening to the distant, rhythmic thudding of the other inmates kicking their doors whenever his name was called over the intercom. While Chris was in jail, the county sheriff's department executed a search warrant on Darla's trailer in the neighboring county, looking for items Chris had allegedly taken from his previous employer. Under the grease-stained mattress in the back bedroom, they found a rusty Colt .45 semi-automatic pistol and a Winchester lever-action rifle. As a convicted felon with an active federal indictment, Chris was barred from being within 50 feet of a firearm. The local charges were immediately upgraded, and the federal prosecutors in Texas revoked his recognizance bond. 2 deputies from the U.S. Marshals Service arrived at the county jail in a white, unmarked van. They handcuffed Chris at the wrists, chained his ankles, and secured the waist chains with a heavy brass padlock. Julian watched from the parking lot as the van pulled out onto the highway, its tires kicking up the gray slush of the winter's first snow. Chris's son was born 3 months into his federal sentence. He was named Christian Jr., but he would never see his father outside of a plexiglass partition. Darla Gentry, facing the reality of raising a child alone on a retail salary while her boyfriend sat in a federal penitentiary in Texas, quickly realized the depth of the lie she had been living. She cut all communication with Chris before his first year of incarceration was complete. When she filed for child support, she did so with the help of a state-appointed attorney who ensured that every cent Chris might ever earn upon his release would be heavily garnished. The letters continued to arrive at the Elm Street house for a while, forwarded through various institutions before Evelyn finally submitted a change of address. Chris wrote about his repentance, about how the devil had taken hold of him in the liquor store, about how he still loved Evelyn, and how those 3 children of hers had ruined his life by turning the town against him. He wrote with the frantic, looping hand of a man who had nothing but time and a stubby pencil. Evelyn never read them past the first line. She would carry them out to the rusted 55-gallon drum in the weeds, pour the amber kerosene, and watch the paper turn to ash. By 2022, they had left the state. Evelyn took an early retirement from the department, her pension secured, and they moved 500 miles north to a small town where the air smelled of hemlock and cold water. Julian and his mother bought an old farmhouse with 5 acres of pasture, a place with sagging sills and peeling paint that gave them something to do with their hands. They spent their weekends replacing the dry-rotted floorboards, scraping the old lead paint off the window frames, and installing double-hung sashes that kept the winter wind out. One evening, while Julian was clean-shaping a piece of cedar trim for the kitchen doorway, his phone buzzed on the workbench. It was a message from an old acquaintance back in their old town. "Heard Chris got out last month," the message read. "He's living in some town in Kansas now, working day labor when his back allows it. Darla's got a lien on his wages for the kid. He looks 70. Julian didn't show the message to his mother. He looked across the room, where Evelyn was sitting near the wood stove, a cup of chamomile tea in her hand. A man named David, a quiet, gray-bearded carpenter who had helped them rebuild the back porch, was sitting opposite her, explaining the difference between radial and flat-sawn oak with a soft, slow drawl. Evelyn was smiling, the deep, bitter lines around her mouth finally softening into something resembling peace. Julian deleted the message, laid his chisel back in its leather roll, and went back to work. The cedar smelled sweet and clean as the shavings fell into the dust at his feet.